Imagine holding a piece of paper that proves your entire life is a lie. You are 8 months pregnant, placed on strict medical bed rest, and your husband of 6 years just slammed a DNA test onto your granite kitchen counter. The result: 0% probability of paternity. He accuses you of the unthinkable. He freezes your bank accounts. He kicks you out into the freezing rain while you go into early labor. But here is the terrifying, cinematic twist. You know you have been completely faithful. Someone intercepted the mail. Someone swapped the DNA swabs. And the woman who orchestrated this entire nightmare. She is sitting right next to your husband, holding a glass of champagne. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we are diving into a chilling masterpiece of domestic betrayal, psychological warfare, and cold-blooded, meticulously drafted revenge. This isn't just a story about a broken marriage. It's a high-stakes masterclass in taking back your power when pushed to the absolute edge. The true value of this story lies in a simple, profound truth. The most dangerous person in the room is never the loudest one, but the one who has nothing left to lose and everything to protect. If you are ready to watch a brilliantly executed checkmate, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below as the story unfolds. Let us get into it.
Click. The brass latch of the nursery window locked into place. The sharp sound echoed in the quiet room. Clara stood perfectly still in the center of the nursery. She rested both hands on the heavy swell of her stomach. 8 months pregnant. The baby kicked hard against her lower ribs. It was a sharp, sudden pressure that stole her breath. She winced. She rubbed the spot gently through her thick cashmere sweater. The room smelled faintly of dried lavender and fresh linen. It was a beautiful, flawless space. Sage green walls, a handcrafted mahogany crib, soft linen drapes that pooled elegantly on the floor. Everything an architect like Clara could design. She had spent months perfecting this room. It was her masterpiece. But tonight, the silence in the large house was simply too loud. The antique grandfather clock in the downstairs hallway ticked. Tick, tock, tick. It was 9:30 in the evening. Clara's lower back ached with a constant, dull throb. This was a high-risk pregnancy. Dr. Vance had been explicitly clear during her last appointment. No stress. No long hours at the architectural firm. Strict monitoring of her blood pressure was required. The transition from her career to her couch had been brutal. Going from managing multi-million-dollar commercial builds to measuring her daily water intake was jarring. It takes a massive, unseen psychological toll on a woman. Your body is no longer your own. It belongs to the medical schedule. It belongs to the fetal monitors. You become a fragile vessel. Every unexpected twinge brings a wave of primal panic. Every doctor visit holds your breath hostage until you hear the rapid, rushing heartbeat on the ultrasound machine. Clara had paused her entire career for this baby. She did it willingly. She wanted this child more than anything in the world. She had built this golden cage for herself, and for a long time, she was happy inside it. She walked carefully out of the nursery. Her soft slippers brushed silently against the polished hardwood floor. She moved down the hallway and entered the master bedroom. She sat on the edge of the large bed. The luxury mattress dipped heavily under her weight. She picked up her phone from the nightstand. The glass screen was cold against her fingers. 3 times. She pressed the side button. Lock. Unlock. Lock. Nothing. The screen showed 0 notifications. No text messages from Harrison. No missed calls. He used to text her every single hour. During her first trimester, his name would flash on her screen constantly. He used to ask about her blood pressure. He used to ask what she was craving. He used to care now. He was just busy, always busy. He blamed the end of the fiscal quarter. He blamed a major corporate merger. He blamed endless meetings with demanding clients. Clara wanted to believe him. She desperately needed to believe him. The alternative was a darkness she was not ready to face. He is just working hard to provide for our family, Clara said aloud. Her voice sounded thin and unconvincing in the large, empty bedroom. That is all it is. But her inner voice refused to be silenced. It told a completely different story. The distance between us is not about his job. Something fundamental has shifted. I can feel the coldness spreading in my own home. The heavy oak front door groaned open downstairs. The deadbolt clicked shut with a sharp, metallic snap. Clara let out a long breath she did not realize she had been holding. She stood up slowly. She smoothed down her maternity sweater, adjusting the fabric over her stomach. She walked out of the bedroom and approached the curved wooden staircase. One hand rested firmly on the smooth banister for balance. Harrison stood in the grand foyer below. He was 36 years old. He wore a tailored navy suit that fit his athletic frame perfectly. His silk tie was already loosened and pulled away from his collar. His dark hair was slightly damp from the autumn rain outside. He carried a heavy brown paper bag in his left hand. The rich, savory smell of roasted garlic, seared steak, and melted butter floated up the stairs. It was takeout from that high-end Italian restaurant downtown, the exclusive place that required reservations 3 weeks in advance. "You are home," Clara said softly from the stairs. Harrison flinched. It was just a fraction of a second, a tiny tightening of his shoulders. But Clara saw it clearly. Traffic was an absolute nightmare, Harrison said. He did not look up at her. He set his leather briefcase on the marble console table. The metal clasps clinked loudly against the cold stone. He slipped out of his wet wool coat. He looked everywhere except at his pregnant wife. He looked at the floor tiles. He looked at the stack of mail. He looked at his own leather shoes. "I brought dinner," he added quickly. He held up the grease-spotted paper bag. "I figured you would be too tired to cook tonight." Clara descended the final steps. The bright overhead lights of the kitchen made her squint. Harrison followed her in. He began unpacking the food in complete silence. The aluminum foil containers crinkled loudly in his hands. "You did not have to get something so expensive," Clara said. She leaned heavily against the cool granite counter. "It was not a big deal," Harrison replied. He handed her a heavy plastic fork. He still avoided meeting her eyes. "I just grabbed it on the way home. You do not just grab food from a Michelin-starred restaurant on a whim. Clara thought. You have to order it ahead of time. You have to plan it. Or someone else planned it for you. Clara opened her container. The intense aroma of truffle oil and heavy cream hit her face. Her stomach instantly turned. A sudden wave of nausea washed over her. Pregnancy hormones amplified every single scent in the room. Right now, the expensive food smelled exactly like guilt. It felt like an overpriced apology for an unknown crime. How was the baby today? Harrison asked. His tone was perfectly flat, rehearsed. He sounded like a project manager asking a subordinate for a weekly status report. She is very active, Clara answered. She watched his face closely. Dr. Vance said, my blood pressure is stable for now, but I need to maintain strict bed rest. No sudden spikes in stress. Harrison nodded quickly. He took a large bite of his steak. He chewed mechanically, staring at the kitchen cabinets. Good. That is really good news. He did not ask if she was in pain. He did not ask if she was scared. Suddenly, his phone buzzed on the granite counter. It was a harsh, vibrating rattle that shattered the quiet kitchen. Harrison's right hand shot out like lightning. He grabbed the phone instantly. He flipped it face down on the stone surface. His knuckles turned stark white from how tightly he gripped the device. Work? Clara asked. Her voice was deliberately steady. Just a demanding client, Harrison said quickly. He swallowed his food with difficulty. It is nothing important. They can wait until tomorrow. He picked up his glass of ice water. He took a very long sip. The muscles in his jaw were tight and rigid. Clara reached across the counter. She placed her hand gently over his free hand. Harrison stiffened. He did not pull away, but his hand turned stiff and lifeless beneath hers. The warmth that used to define their marriage was completely gone. He felt like a stranger sitting at her kitchen island. Dinner ended in less than 15 minutes. It was an agonizing, silent affair. The only sounds were the quiet scraping of forks against aluminum and the low, steady hum of the kitchen refrigerator. I need a shower, Harrison announced suddenly. He stood up abruptly. He pushed his tall wooden chair back. The legs scraped harshly against the floor tiles. He grabbed his phone from the counter. He did not slide it into his suit pocket. He gripped it tightly in his palm, pressing the screen against his leg. Clara watched him walk away. She stayed in the kitchen alone. She began packing the untouched leftovers into glass storage containers. Her hands moved automatically. A few minutes later, the heavy sound of running water echoed down from the second floor. The master bathroom shower was running. Clara wiped down the granite counters with a damp cloth. She turned off the bright kitchen lights. She walked upstairs slowly, letting the darkness of the house wrap around her. Her lower back throbbed with a sharp intensity now. She entered the master bedroom. The heavy bathroom door was closed tight. The exhaust fan hummed loudly. White steam curled softly from underneath the wooden door frame. Clara walked over to Harrison's side of the bed. She looked down at his mahogany nightstand. Harrison had a strict evening routine. He always left his silver watch, his wallet, and his phone on that exact spot on the nightstand before getting into the shower. It was an unbreakable habit. He had done it every single night for the 6 years they had been married. His silver watch was sitting there. The metal face was still slightly warm from his wrist. His leather wallet was placed neatly beside it. His phone was missing. Clara stared at the empty space on the polished wood. The realization hit her chest like a heavy physical blow. A freezing rush of adrenaline flooded her veins, making her fingertips tingle. He had taken his phone into the bathroom. He had taken it into the shower. Clara stepped closer to the closed bathroom door. She held her breath. She listened intently. Over the loud, rushing sound of the shower water, she heard it. A faint, distinct electronic chime. A text message alert. Coming from inside the steamy bathroom. Clara did not scream. She did not bang her fists against the heavy wooden door. She did not demand an explanation. She took a slow step backward. She stood perfectly still in the center of their beautiful, expensive bedroom. The brilliant summer of their marriage was officially over. The heating system in the house was running, but a freezing, terrifying chill settled deep into Clara's bones. She looked down at her swollen stomach. She placed both hands protectively over her unborn daughter. Her breathing slowed. Her mind became incredibly clear. The confusion and the anxiety vanished, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. He is hiding something, Clara thought. Her inner voice was no longer whispering or questioning. It was an absolute, undeniable declaration. My husband is hiding a secret, and whatever it is going to destroy this perfect life. The morning light filtered through the heavy linen drapes of the master bedroom. It was a pale, gray light. The autumn rain from the previous night had left the neighborhood damp and terribly quiet. Clara sat on the edge of the mattress. The house was completely silent. Harrison had already left for the office. He had slipped out before 6 in the morning, claiming he had an emergency breakfast meeting with the board of directors. He had barely kissed her cheek. His lips had felt like dry ice against her skin. She looked down at her cell phone resting in her lap. 3 times. She pressed the side button. Lock, unlock, lock. She had done this obsessively for the last 20 minutes, waiting for his usual morning text message. The one that said he arrived safely. The one that asked how she had slept. The screen remained dark. Clara took a deep, shaky breath. She stood up and walked toward his side of the room. His navy wool coat from the night before was draped carelessly over the back of a velvet armchair. She reached out to hang it up in the closet. As she lifted the heavy fabric, a scent drifted upward. Clara froze. She brought the collar of the coat closer to her face. She closed her eyes and inhaled slowly. It was not his usual cedarwood cologne. It was something else. Something aggressively sweet. A sharp, synthetic blend of vanilla and white freesia. It was a decidedly feminine perfume. It clung heavily to the wool, right near the lapel. He stood very close to someone wearing this, Clara thought. Her inner voice was calm but firm. Someone leaned into his chest. She quickly hung the coat in the dark closet. She walked into the master bathroom and washed her hands with scalding hot water. trying to scrub the phantom scent of vanilla from her fingertips. She looked at her pale face in the brightly lit mirror. Dark circles bruised the delicate skin under her eyes. "You are just hormonal," Clara whispered to her reflection. "Pregnancy heightens your sense of smell. You are imagining things. He works with hundreds of women. You are driving yourself crazy over nothing." She went downstairs to the kitchen. She poured herself a cup of bitter decaffeinated coffee. It tasted like burnt ash on her tongue. The silence of the empty house pressed against her eardrums. She needed fresh air. Clara wrapped a thick wool shawl over her shoulders and walked out the front door. The morning air was sharp and biting. Dead brown leaves coated the damp driveway. She walked slowly down the long stone path to the black metal mailbox at the end of the curb. She opened the heavy metal door. It squeaked loudly in the quiet neighborhood. A stack of glossy magazines, utility bills, and grocery store flyers rested inside. Buried in the center of the stack was a single, plain white envelope. It had no return address. There was no postage stamp. It had not been processed by the postal service. Someone had walked up to her house in the middle of the night and placed it directly inside. Clara pulled the envelope out. The paper was crisp and stiff. Her name was printed on the front in bold, black ink. Just Clara, not Mrs. Clara, not her full legal name. A cold droplet of water fell from the oak tree above and hit her cheek. She shivered. She walked back inside, locking the heavy front door behind her. She set her coffee mug on the granite kitchen island. She picked up a silver letter opener. With one smooth motion, she sliced the top of the envelope open. Inside was a single sheet of printer paper. It was folded perfectly in half. Clara opened it. There was only one sentence typed in the center of the bright white page. "Everyone knows you are sleeping with him again. And Harrison is going to find out the baby is not his." Clara stared at the black letters. They seemed to float and blur on the page. A loud ringing started deep in her ears. Her lungs felt instantly tight. She grabbed the edge of the granite counter to steady herself. It was a completely absurd accusation. She had never been unfaithful to Harrison. She had barely left the house in the past 4 months due to the high-risk nature of her pregnancy. The idea of an affair was not just insulting. It was physically impossible. "Someone is trying to hurt us," Clara thought. Her hands shook slightly. "Someone wants to plant a bomb in my marriage." She spent the entire day pacing the hardwood floors. She could not eat. The baby kicked violently against her ribs, reacting to the sudden spike of adrenaline in her bloodstream. Clara rubbed her stomach, trying to soothe the child. She waited for Harrison to come home. She needed her husband. She needed him to hold her, to tear the letter to pieces, to promise her that they were safe. Harrison walked through the front door at exactly 6 in the evening. Clara was waiting for him in the kitchen. The white paper sat dead center on the granite island, illuminated by the overhead pendant lights. "What is that?" Harrison asked. He dropped his briefcase on the floor. He did not bother taking off his coat. He walked straight toward the paper. Clara watched him read it. She watched his dark eyes scan the single typed sentence. The anonymous letter did not frighten her. Harrison's reaction to it did. A normal husband would have been confused. A normal husband would have laughed at the sheer absurdity of the claim. A normal husband would have looked at his heavily pregnant wife, seen her distress, and immediately comforted her. Harrison did none of those things. His face flushed a deep, violent crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his white shirt collar. His hands began to shake with a furious, immediate anger. Who wrote this? Harrison demanded. His voice was a harsh, guttural bark. It echoed terribly in the kitchen. I have no idea, Clara answered softly. I found it in the mailbox this morning. There is no stamp. Someone put it there. Is it true? Harrison asked. He slammed his hand flat against the granite counter. The sudden, explosive sound made Clara jump backward. Clara stared at him in absolute shock. The room seemed to tilt sideways. What? Clara whispered. Her voice was barely audible. I asked you a simple question. Clara, Harrison shouted. He took a step toward her. His dark eyes were wild and accusing. Is it true? Have you been seeing someone else behind my back? Harrison, I have been on strict bed rest for 4 months, Clara said. She forced her voice to remain steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. I barely leave this house to buy groceries. How could you possibly ask me that? Do not play the victim with me. Harrison snapped. He began pacing the length of the kitchen. His leather shoes slapped sharply against the tile. You have been distant lately. You are always complaining about being tired. You sit around this house all day. Who knows who you are texting? Who knows who you invite over when I am breaking my back at the office to pay for all of this? He gestured wildly to the expensive kitchen. He was breathing heavily. He is projecting. Clara realized. The inner voice spoke with a sudden, chilling clarity. He is deflecting the blame onto me. He is using this lie to justify his own anger. I am not playing the victim, Clara said firmly. She did not raise her voice. She refused to match his chaotic energy. Someone left a malicious note in our mailbox. Someone is trying to sabotage our family. We need to focus on who would do this. No, Harrison interrupted. He pointed a long finger directly at her face. No, I am not going to be the fool in my own marriage. I am not going to raise another man's child. The words hung in the air, heavy, toxic, unforgivable. Clara felt a profound ache settle deep into her bones. It was a dull, lingering pain. It was the absolute heartbreak of not being trusted by the person who was supposed to be her partner. You know this child is yours, Clara said slowly. Every word tasted like ash. I do not know anything anymore. Harrison sneered. He ran a hand forcefully through his dark hair. I want a paternity test. I want absolute proof. I am 8 months pregnant. Harrison, Clara said. A prenatal test carries risks. Dr. Vance has already warned us about stressing my body. There are non-invasive tests now. Harrison countered immediately. He spoke too fast. He had the answer ready before she even finished her sentence. You just draw a little blood from the mother and swab the inside of the father's cheek. It is perfectly safe. It separates the fetal DNA from the mother's blood. Clara watched him carefully. How do you know the exact medical procedure for a prenatal paternity test? Harrison blinked. A flash of panic crossed his features, quickly replaced by defensive anger. I looked it up today, while I was at work, because I have been feeling like something is wrong between us for weeks. This letter just confirms my suspicions. He was lying. Clara could feel it in the pit of her stomach. The timeline did not make sense, but the sheer force of his anger was exhausting her. Her lower back began to throb with that familiar, terrifying ache. Fine, Clara said softly. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. If it will ease your mind, if it will stop this ridiculous fighting, we will ask Dr. Vance to schedule the blood work tomorrow morning. No, Harrison said quickly. He held up a hand. We are not dragging your fancy doctor into this. I am not going to have my personal marital problems broadcasted to hospital staff. It is humiliating. Then how do you expect to do the test? Clara asked. I already ordered a kit, Harrison stated. He crossed his arms over his chest. A private laboratory in California. They overnighted it to my office. I have it in my briefcase right now. We can do the swabbing here, in private. I will personally mail it back to the lab tomorrow. The results are completely confidential. It only takes a few days. Clara looked at the expensive leather briefcase resting by the front door. He had ordered it before today. He had planned this before she even found the letter in the mailbox. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. By agreeing to the test, she was handing him the weapon he wanted. But she had nothing to hide. She knew the child was his. She believed that once the paper arrived proving his paternity, his ridiculous paranoia would evaporate. She believed the truth would save her marriage. Bring me the kit, Clara said. Her voice was flat and entirely devoid of emotion. Harrison practically ran to his briefcase. He pulled out a sleek, white cardboard box with bright blue medical lettering on the front. He brought it to the kitchen island. He opened it with eager, trembling hands. He pulled out a small, sterile needle for her finger and two long cotton swabs for his own cheek. Clara sat perfectly still at the kitchen counter. She allowed him to prick her finger. She watched the bright red drop of her blood fall onto the collection card. She watched him rigorously swab the inside of his own mouth, his eyes dark and completely unreadable. When it was done, Harrison sealed the samples in a tamper-proof plastic envelope. He held it tightly against his chest, as if it were the most valuable thing in the world. I will drop this off at the express courier first thing tomorrow morning, Harrison said. His voice was suddenly much calmer. The violent rage had evaporated, replaced by a strange, unsettling satisfaction. Clara said nothing. She pressed a small cotton ball against her bleeding finger. She watched him walk away toward his home office, clutching the white envelope. The first autumn rain had fallen. The small signs were no longer just her imagination. The unease was real. Something terrible was gathering in the dark corners of her perfect home, and Clara was completely alone in the storm. The ticking of the car engine was the only sound in the damp afternoon air. Tick, tick, tick. Clara sat in the driver's seat of her SUV. She stared through the windshield at her own front door. The large brick house loomed over the driveway like a fortress. It was 3:30 in the afternoon. She had just returned from the pharmacy with a brown paper bag of prenatal vitamins. She turned the key backward. The engine shut off completely. She did not open the car door. She unbuckled her seatbelt and let it retract with a soft zip. She sat there in the silence. 5 minutes passed, then 10 minutes. The cold leather steering wheel chilled her palms. A light drizzle began to hit the glass. She watched the water bead and roll down the windshield. She could not bring herself to walk inside. For the first time in her life, she was terrified of her own home. The beautiful house felt poisoned. The walls held too many secrets. The air inside felt thick and unbreathable. Since the night of the cotton swabs, Harrison had become a ghost. He slept on the far edge of the mattress. He spoke only in short, clipped sentences. He watched her with a heavy, paranoid suspicion. Clara rubbed her tired eyes. She finally grabbed her purse and forced herself to walk up the stone path. She unlocked the heavy front door. The house was dark. Harrison would not be home for hours. Clara went straight to the kitchen to pour a glass of water. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a calendar reminder. Dr. Vance's office had sent a notification. Week 32 of the pregnancy. Clara drank the cold water. It tasted metallic and sharp. She touched her swollen stomach. The dull, aching pain in her lower back had become a constant companion. 2 days dragged by with agonizing slowness. The silence in the house grew heavier. It was a crushing, physical weight. It was Thursday night, midnight. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed with harsh red numbers. 12:03. Harrison was asleep, or at least he was pretending to be asleep. His breathing was slow and measured, but his back was rigid. He faced the opposite wall. Clara lay flat on her back. She stared up at the dark ceiling. The shadows in the room looked like twisted branches. Suddenly, the black screen of Harrison's phone illuminated the nightstand. A bright, harsh blue light cut through the dark bedroom. The phone did not ring. It only vibrated. A short, sharp buzz against the polished mahogany wood. Clara slowly turned her head. Harrison did not move. He kept his breathing perfectly even. Clara slipped quietly out from under the heavy down comforter. She walked around the large bed. Her bare feet made no sound on the thick wool rug. She stood over his nightstand and looked down at the glowing screen. It was a text message. The sender's name was saved as Page Junior Analyst. The message preview was brief. Are you awake? I cannot stop thinking about tomorrow. Clara stared at the glowing letters. Page, the new girl at Harrison's financial firm. Clara had met her exactly once at a company holiday party last December. Paige was 28 years old. She wore too much expensive perfume, the exact same perfume that had lingered heavily on Harrison's wool coat just a few days ago. Vanilla and white freesia. Before the screen could go dark, the phone vibrated again. The text message disappeared, replaced by an incoming phone call. Paige was calling him at midnight. Harrison shifted under the blankets. He was waking up. Clara reacted on pure instinct. She reached down and snatched the phone off the nightstand. She pressed the green button to accept the call. She lifted the cold glass to her ear. She did not say a word. She held her breath. The line was open. She could hear the faint sound of traffic in the background. She heard a soft, feminine sigh. Harrison, a woman whispered. It was Paige. Her voice was intimate and completely relaxed. Did you get the tracking notification? It arrives tomorrow. Clara closed her eyes. The floor beneath her feet felt like it was crumbling into dust. She remained absolutely silent. Harrison, Paige asked again. Her tone shifted. The intimacy vanished, replaced by sudden, sharp suspicion. Who is this? Clara pressed the red button. The call ended. The screen went completely black. She set the phone gently back on the mahogany wood. She walked slowly back to her side of the bed. She sat on the edge of the mattress. A sudden, violent kick against her lower ribs made her gasp softly. The baby was restless. Harrison rolled over in the dark. The heavy blankets rustled loudly. What are you doing? He mumbled. His voice was thick with fake sleep. Why are you awake? Clara looked at his dark silhouette. He is attacking my character, while his child moves inside me. Clara thought. Her inner voice was perfectly clear and terrifyingly calm. I have to protect my peace, or I will lose my mind. Just getting a glass of water, Clara said evenly. She lay back down. She pulled the blankets up to her chin. She did not sleep for the rest of the night. The next afternoon, the tension in the house reached a breaking point. It was Friday, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Harrison came home from the office unexpectedly early. He slammed the front door shut. His heavy leather shoes echoed loudly against the foyer tiles. He marched directly into the kitchen. He did not take off his coat. He did not put down his briefcase. He walked straight to the kitchen island. He dropped a thick, white cardboard envelope onto the dark granite counter. It landed with a heavy, decisive slap. The logo of the private laboratory in California was printed clearly in the top left corner. It is here, Harrison said. His chest heaved up and down. His dark eyes were fixed entirely on the thick white envelope. Clara stood by the sink. She had been washing a single coffee mug. She turned the silver faucet off. The sudden silence in the kitchen was deafening. Open it, Clara said. Her voice was steady. She dried her trembling hands on a linen towel. Harrison grabbed a silver steak knife from the wooden block on the counter. He sliced through the heavy cardboard tape with aggressive force. He pulled out a single sheet of official medical paper. It was stamped with a gold foil seal. He unfolded the thick paper. He stared at the black ink. Clara watched his face carefully. She expected relief. She expected him to read the words, drop the paper, and apologize for his horrific behavior. She expected the nightmare to finally end. Instead, all the color drained completely from Harrison's face. His jaw dropped. His hands began to shake violently. The thick paper rattled in his grip. He slowly looked up at her. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated hatred. The paper in his hand was an impossible lie, and he believed it. You absolute liar, Harrison hissed. His voice was a venomous whisper. You lying, cheating sociopath. He crumpled the official document into a tight ball. He threw it forcefully at her chest. It hit her shoulder and bounced onto the kitchen floor. Harrison, what are you talking about? Clara asked. Panic finally broke through her calm facade. She took a step back, pressing her spine against the cold edge of the sink. 0%. Harrison screamed. His voice echoed off the high kitchen ceiling. He slammed his fists onto the granite counter. Zero probability of paternity. It is not mine. Clara stared at the crumpled paper on the floor tiles. The world tilted violently on its axis. That is impossible, Clara said. Her voice shook. That is medically impossible. You know that. I know that. The laboratory in California says otherwise. Harrison laughed. It was a cold, cruel sound. The DNA does not match. I am not the father. You have been playing me for a fool this entire time. Look at me, Clara pleaded. She stepped forward. Harrison, please look at me. I have never touched another man. I have been entirely faithful to you. There is a mistake. The lab made a mistake. Labs do not make mistakes like this, Harrison sneered. He backed away from her as if she were carrying a plague. I packed the swabs myself. I mailed them myself. There is no mistake. You are pregnant with another man's child, and you wanted me to pay for it. You are insane, Clara said. The dull pain in her chest suddenly transformed into a sharp, terrifying realization. You are looking for an excuse. You want this to be true. Harrison did not answer her. He turned his back completely. He walked out of the kitchen with heavy, rapid steps. Clara heard him running up the wooden stairs. She heard the loud slam of the master bedroom door. She bent down clumsily. Her large stomach made the movement difficult. She picked up the crumpled ball of paper. She smoothed it out on the counter with shaking fingers. The gold seal was there, the signatures were there. The bold black letters at the bottom of the page read, Probability of paternity, 0%. Clara stared at the numbers. They blurred together through a sudden rush of hot tears. 15 minutes later, Harrison came back downstairs. He carried a large black leather duffel bag over his shoulder. He walked past the kitchen without looking at her. My lawyer will contact you on Monday, Harrison said. His voice was devoid of all warmth. I want you out of this house by the end of the month. You cannot do this, Clara said. A single tear escaped and rolled down her pale cheek. I am 8 months pregnant. This is your child. You are walking away from your own daughter based on a lie. Do not ever contact me again, Harrison said. He opened the heavy front door. The damp autumn air rushed inside. He stepped out into the gray afternoon and pulled the door firmly shut behind him. The lock clicked. Clara stood alone in the massive kitchen. The silence rushed back in, suffocating and complete. She heard the low rumble of his car engine starting in the driveway. She listened as the sound faded away down the street, until there was nothing left but the ticking of the kitchen clock. Tick, tock, tick. Clara raised her hand. She pressed her fingertips against her wet cheek. She wiped her tears away with a slow, deliberate motion. Her chest stopped heaving. Her breathing slowed to a steady, rhythmic pace. She looked down at the fraudulent paper resting on the granite counter. The other woman, the late night phone call, the tracking notification. The pieces locked together in her mind with a terrifying, mechanical precision. She wiped her tears. That was the last time she would cry for him. The house was completely still. The silence left behind by Harrison S. departure was not peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum. Clara did not move from the kitchen for a long time. She simply stood there, listening to the rain gently hitting the large glass windows. Her breathing was slow and entirely controlled. She turned away from the kitchen island. She left the crumpled, fraudulent DNA test resting on the cold granite. She walked slowly out of the kitchen and climbed the curved wooden staircase. Her hand slid along the smooth banister. Her heavy steps were the only sound in the massive, empty house. She walked past the master bedroom. She did not even look at the open door. She went straight down the hallway and entered the nursery. The room was dim. The soft gray light of the rainy afternoon filtered through the linen drapes. Clara lowered herself clumsily onto the plush white rug in the center of the room. The physical effort made her lower back ache with a sharp, warning throb. She opened the bottom drawer of the mahogany changing table. Inside were stacks of freshly washed baby clothes. She pulled out a pile of tiny, pale yellow receiving blankets. A long silence filled the room. Clara sat on the floor, fully dressed in her thick maternity sweater, and began to fold the blankets. She took a square of soft cotton flannel. She folded it perfectly in half. She smoothed the edges with her thumbs. She folded it in half again. She placed it neatly on the floor beside her. She picked up the next blanket. Fold, smooth, fold, place. She did this for 20 minutes. She did not cry. She did not scream. She did not wonder why her husband was leaving her. She simply folded the yellow blankets in absolute silence. The rhythmic, repetitive motion was an anchor. It was a universal action of motherhood, a physical manifestation of order in a world that had just been violently turned upside down. The soft texture of the warm cotton against her fingertips grounded her racing mind. When every single blanket was folded into a perfect, flawless square, Clara placed them back into the drawer. She closed it with a soft click. She stood up. Her knees cracked softly in the quiet room. She walked back downstairs to the kitchen. She walked over to the stainless steel sink. The single coffee mug she had been washing earlier was still sitting on the drying rack. Clara picked it up. She turned the silver faucet all the way to the left. The water ran steaming and fiercely hot. She pumped a harsh chemical dish soap onto a sponge. She washed the white ceramic mug. She scrubbed the rim intensely. She rinsed it under the scalding water. Her skin turned bright red. She did not put the mug down. She pumped more soap onto the sponge. She washed the exact same mug a second time. The hot water burned her knuckles. She welcomed the sharp, biting pain. It felt real. It sliced through the terrifying numbness that had wrapped around her chest. She rinsed it again. She pumped more soap. She washed the mug for a third time. She scrubbed until her wrists ached. She let the scalding water run over her bare hands for a full minute, just to feel something physical, just to prove to herself that she was still alive. She finally turned the water off. She dried her burning, red hands on a linen towel. Clara turned back to the kitchen island. She looked down at the official laboratory document. She was an architect. Her entire professional career was built on finding structural flaws. She spent her days looking at massive, complex blueprints, searching for the one tiny error that could cause a building to collapse. She knew how to look at documents. She knew how to find the lie in the math. She flattened the thick paper with her red, raw hands. She read every single line of text. She ignored the massive, bold letters that proclaimed 0% probability. She looked at the tiny print. She looked at the administrative data at the very top of the page. Patient 1, Clara, female. Date of birth correct. Patient 2, Harrison, male. Date of birth correct. Then she looked at the bottom of the page. The chain of custody block. It listed the tracking number of the inbound package that the laboratory had received. Clara walked over to the garbage can. She pulled out the torn white cardboard envelope that Harrison had discarded earlier. The shipping label was still attached to the front. She placed the envelope next to the laboratory paper. She read the tracking number on the shipping label. It did not match the tracking number printed on the laboratory report. Clara took a sharp breath. She looked closer at the shipping label. The return address was listed as the private laboratory in California. But she looked at the tiny postal barcode at the very bottom of the sticker. She looked at the origin zip code where the package was actually scanned into the postal system. It was not a California zip code. It was a local zip code, the exact zip code of the downtown financial district, the exact neighborhood where Harrison and Page worked. The pieces fell into place with a terrifying, heavy finality. Harrison had not mailed the swabs to California. He had brought them to work. Page had taken the package. Page had swapped the physical envelope. Page had sent a completely different swab to the lab under Harrison's name. That was the late night phone call. That was the tracking notification they were whispering about. I am not crazy, Clara whispered to the empty kitchen. Her inner voice solidified into a fortress of absolute certainty. I know exactly what I saw. I know exactly what they did. Her sadness evaporated instantly. The dull, aching heartbreak froze solid. Her anger transformed into something entirely different. It became a cold, terrifying composure. She was going to destroy them, but she was going to do it quietly. Clara left the papers on the counter. She walked into the living room and lay down on the large velvet sofa. She pulled a woven throw blanket over her pregnant stomach. She slept for the first time in 3 days. It was a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning broke with cold, harsh sunlight. Clara woke up at 8 o'clock. Her lower back was stiff from the sofa. She walked to the kitchen to make a cup of tea. She opened the refrigerator. It was nearly empty. She needed fresh fruit, milk, and vegetables for her strict pregnancy diet. She picked up her phone and opened a grocery delivery application. She added $100 worth of healthy food to her digital cart. She clicked the button to process the payment using her primary debit card. A small red circle spun on the screen. Then a harsh red error message popped up. Transaction declined. Please contact your financial institution. Clara frowned. She opened her banking application. She typed in her password. The screen loaded. Her checking account showed a balance of $0. Her joint savings account, the one they had built together for the past 6 years, the one holding over $80,000 for the baby S hospital bills and future education, was completely gone. The account was locked. He froze the bank accounts at 9 in the morning. Harrison had not just left her. He was trying to starve her out. He was trying to leave his 8-month pregnant wife absolutely destitute, punishing her for a crime she did not commit, using evidence his own mistress had fabricated. Clara set her phone down on the counter. She did not panic. She did not call him to beg. She picked up her purse, pulled out a secret emergency credit card she had kept hidden from him since before they were married, and grabbed her car keys. It was time to go to war. The heavy glass doors of the maternal medicine clinic slid open with a soft electronic hum. Clara walked into the brightly lit reception area. The air inside smelled sharply of lemon, disinfectant, and sterile alcohol wipes. It was a smell that usually brought her intense anxiety, reminding her of her fragile pregnancy. Today, the clinical coldness was exactly what she needed. It was logical, it was structured. She approached the front desk. She did not ask to be squeezed in. She quietly told the receptionist she had an emergency. 10 minutes later, she was sitting on the crinkling white paper of the examination table. The room was freezing. The air conditioner hummed loudly in the ceiling. Dr. Vance walked into the room. He was 52 years old. He had graying hair and kind, tired eyes behind silver wire glasses. He held her thick medical chart in his hands. Clara, Dr. Vance said. His voice was deep and steady. Your blood pressure reading at the desk was elevated. Are you experiencing any cramping, any spotting, physically? The baby and I are fine, Clara answered. Her voice was flat and entirely devoid of emotion. I am not here for a medical emergency. I am here for a legal one. Dr. Vance lowered the chart. He looked at her closely. He did not interrupt. I need a non-invasive prenatal paternity test, Clara stated. She looked directly into his eyes. Her qualifiers had completely disappeared. She did not say she thought she needed one, or ask if it was possible. She demanded it. I need it done today. I need it done with a strict, legally binding chain of custody. Dr. Vance sighed softly. He set the chart down on the metal counter. The metal clipboard clattered loudly against the steel. Clara, those tests are highly specialized, Dr. Vance explained gently. They are expensive, and usually we only order them when there is a serious custody dispute. Are you and Harrison? Harrison left me yesterday. Clara interrupted. She kept her chin high. He presented me with an at-home DNA kit. It claimed he was not the father. He packed a bag, froze our joint bank accounts, and told me to be out of the house by the end of the month. Dr. Vance stood perfectly still. His clinical detachment fractured for just a second, revealing a flash of deep, protective anger. An at-home kit, Dr. Vance asked, his tone sharpened with professional disgust. Sent through the regular mail. Yes, Clara said. Those are completely worthless in a court of law, Dr. Vance stated firmly. He crossed his arms over his white coat. There is absolutely no proof of who provided the swab. I have seen cases where jealous relatives swabbed a dog's mouth just to cause a divorce. Anyone can intercept the mail. Anyone can fake the sample. I know, Clara said. I found the shipping discrepancy. His junior colleague intercepted the package. She swapped the sample, but Harrison believes it. He wants to believe it. Dr. Vance nodded slowly. He walked over to his computer monitor and began typing rapidly. The keyboard clicked with a sharp, rapid rhythm. A legal chain of custody test is different, Dr. Vance explained. I will draw your blood here. We will photograph you. We will copy your driver's license. The laboratory will secure the sample under lock and key, but we still need the father's sample to compare it against. Can you extract his profile from a previous medical record? Clara asked. He had minor knee surgery at this hospital 3 years ago. Dr. Vance stopped typing. He looked at her with a profound, quiet respect. Yes, we have his genetic markers on file in the hospital network. I can request a secure comparison. The results will take about 7 to 10 business days. It will be a certified medical document. No one can dispute it. Do it, Clara said. She opened her purse. She pulled out the bright blue emergency credit card she had hidden for years. She handed it to him. It costs $800. Dr. Vance warned softly. Run the card. Clara answered. 10 minutes later, the sharp sting of the needle pierced her vein. Clara watched the dark red blood fill the plastic vial. She did not flinch. She felt a deep, fierce satisfaction. Every drop of blood in that vial was a bullet for her legal gun. She walked out of the clinic 30 minutes later. She got into her car. She locked the doors. She pressed a white cotton ball against the crook of her elbow. She sat in the quiet parking lot for 4 minutes. The engine was off. She closed her eyes. She focused entirely on the steady, rhythmic beating of her own heart. Thump, thump, thump. I am not crazy, Clara whispered to the empty car. Her inner voice was a powerful, unbreakable declaration. I know the truth of my own life. She started the engine and drove out of the parking lot. She did not drive back to the empty, terrifying house. She drove across town to a towering glass office building. Meredith was waiting for her in the lobby. Meredith was 35 years old. She was Clara S.'s childhood best friend. She wore a sharp black blazer and pointed leather heels. She was a senior corporate accountant, and she did not tolerate fools. Meredith grabbed Clara by the arm and guided her out of the busy lobby. They walked to a small, quiet coffee shop across the street. The air inside smelled of roasted espresso beans and toasted bread. They sat in a dark corner booth. Clara slid the crumpled, fake DNA report across the wooden table. She placed the torn shipping envelope right next to it. Meredith picked up her reading glasses. She slid them onto her nose. She looked at the papers for less than 60 seconds. He is an idiot, Meredith announced loudly. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the local tracking zip code. He is an absolute, monumental idiot. He works in finance. How could he not check the origin scan of a package? He did not want to check, Clara said. She wrapped her hands around a warm mug of herbal tea. He wanted an excuse. He wanted a way out of the marriage without looking like the bad guy. This fake test makes me the villain. It allows him to play the victim. Meredith took a slow sip of her black coffee. She looked at Clara over the rim of the white cup. Honey, I have been biting my tongue for years, Meredith said gently. Her voice dropped to a fiercely protective whisper. I never liked how he spoke to you in public. I never liked how he made you shrink. You paused your entire brilliant career for him, and he treated you like an accessory. Clara stared into her tea. The warm steam brushed against her pale face. He locked the bank accounts this morning, Clara said quietly. Meredith slammed her coffee cup down. The dark liquid splashed over the rim. Oh no, he did not, Meredith growled. Her accountant instincts instantly flared to life. He thinks he can hide marital assets just by locking a debit card. He picked the wrong woman to financially abuse. And he definitely picked the wrong woman's best friend. Meredith pulled a sleek silver laptop from her leather tote bag. She opened it on the small wooden table. I need your social security number, your mortgage account number, and every single password you can remember, Meredith ordered. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. We are going to pull 10 years of his financial history. If he bought that little girl so much as a cup of coffee using marital funds, I will find it. We are going to build a fortress. Clara, when the real test results arrive, we are going to bury him. Clara felt the baby kick. It was a strong, healthy movement. She looked at Meredith. The suffocating isolation of the past few days began to melt away. She was no longer fighting alone. The early winter frost had settled in, but her anger had frozen into something unbreakable. Let's get to work, Clara said. The antique grandfather clock in the downstairs hallway chimed 10 times. The heavy, metallic sound reverberated through the empty, cold house. Clara sat at the kitchen island. She was completely surrounded by thick stacks of printed paper. Meredith had worked with terrifying speed. In just a few hours, they had pulled years of bank statements, credit card bills, and mortgage records. Clara was meticulously highlighting inconsistencies with a bright yellow marker. Suddenly, a massive, invisible hand gripped her lower abdomen. Clara dropped the yellow marker. It rolled off the granite counter and hit the floor tiles with a sharp clatter. This was not the dull, familiar ache in her lower back. This was a sudden, violent tightening of her entire stomach. It felt as though a wide iron belt was being pulled viciously tight around her waist. The pain was sharp, breathless, and utterly overwhelming. She gripped the edge of the granite counter. Her knuckles turned stark white. She squeezed her eyes shut and forced herself to breathe, in through the nose, out through the mouth. After 40 seconds, the iron grip slowly released. Clara opened her eyes. She was panting softly. A cold sweat had broken out across her forehead. Just Braxton Hicks, Clara whispered into the quiet kitchen. Just false labor. It is just stress. She reached down to pick up the marker. Before her fingers could touch the plastic, a second wave of pain hit her. This one was much stronger than the first. It forced her down onto her knees. She grabbed the cabinet handle to keep from collapsing completely onto the hard floor. The stress of the false DNA test, the abandonment, and the financial betrayal had finally overloaded her physical body. Her body was going into early labor. She was only 32 weeks pregnant. It was far too early. Primal panic instantly overrode all of her logical, cold anger. The architect vanished. The fierce investigator vanished. Only the terrified mother remained. She reached blindly for her cell phone on the counter. Her trembling fingers pulled up her contact list. She pressed Harrison's name. It was an automatic reflex. He was her husband. He was the father of this baby. No matter what had happened, he needed to know his child was in danger. The phone rang once. It rang twice. Click. You have reached the voicemail of Harrison. Please leave a message. He had forwarded her call directly to his voicemail. He was holding his phone, saw her name flashing on the screen, and deliberately pressed a button to decline the call from his 8-month pregnant wife. The pain in Clara's chest suddenly rivaled the pain in her stomach. She did not leave a message. She threw the phone into her leather purse. She grabbed her car keys. She could not wait for an ambulance. The hospital was only 3 miles away, but the storm outside was escalating rapidly. Clara stumbled out the front door and into the freezing autumn rain. The icy water soaked her hair immediately. The wind whipped her heavy maternity sweater around her legs. She climbed into the driver's seat of her SUV. She started the engine. Her wet hands slipped on the cold leather steering wheel. She backed out of the long driveway and turned onto the dark, slick road. The drive was an absolute nightmare. The windshield wipers thumped frantically back and forth, struggling to clear the blinding sheets of rain. Another contraction hit her as she stopped at a red light. Clara let out a sharp, guttural cry. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against the cold steering wheel. The green light illuminated the wet glass, but she could not press the gas pedal until the pain finally subsided. When she finally pulled up to the bright red emergency room entrance, a security guard ran out with a wheelchair. 10 minutes later, Clara was lying in a hospital bed in the maternal triage unit. The bright fluorescent lights blinded her. The room smelled sharply of bleach and iodine. 2 nurses worked quickly, attaching round, sticky patches to her swollen stomach. The monitor beeped. The contractions were 5 minutes apart. We need to slow this down right now, a young resident doctor said urgently. He pushed a clear syringe into her intravenous line. You are only 32 weeks. We are giving you a medication to stop the contractions and a steroid shot to help the baby's lungs, just in case. Clara nodded weakly. The chemical taste of the medication flooded her mouth. It made her heart race wildly. Is your husband on his way? The older nurse asked gently. She placed a warm blanket over Clara's shivering legs. "He is not coming," Clara answered. Her voice cracked. It was the most painful sentence she had ever spoken. The nurse gave her a deeply sympathetic look, then turned off the harsh overhead lights. The staff left the room, giving the medication time to work. Clara was left completely alone in the dim hospital room. The physical pain began to dull, replaced by a heavy, exhausting numbness. She reached for her purse on the plastic bedside table. She pulled out her phone. She just wanted a distraction. She wanted to look at anything other than the sterile white walls. She opened a social media application. Right at the top of her feed was a newly tagged photo. It was posted by a mutual friend from Harrison's financial firm. Clara stared at the glowing screen. The photo was taken inside a highly exclusive downtown cocktail lounge. The lighting was moody and expensive. In the center of the frame sat Harrison. He was wearing his tailored navy suit. His arm was draped casually over the back of a red velvet booth. Sitting right next to him, leaning intimately into his chest, was Paige. She was holding a crystal glass of champagne. Harrison was looking down at her with a soft, relaxed smile. The caption below the photo read, "Celebrating new beginnings with the best team." It was posted 45 minutes ago, exactly when Clara was on her knees in the kitchen, gripped by the terrifying pain of early labor. Exactly when he had forwarded her desperate phone call to voicemail. He was drinking champagne with the woman who faked his DNA test while his wife was fighting for their child's life in a freezing hospital room. Clara dropped the phone onto the bed. She did not cry. She had no tears left. The deepest, most profound wound had just been inflicted, but instead of breaking her, it cauterized her. The physical pain of the contractions and the emotional agony of the betrayal completely merged into one solid block of ice inside her chest. She stopped, hoping he would realize his mistake. She stopped, hoping he would rush through the hospital doors to hold her hand. She turned her head away from the phone. She looked at the medical monitor beside the bed. The room was completely quiet, except for the machine. A bright green line spiked and dipped across the black screen. Thump, thump, thump. It was the baby's heartbeat. Fast, strong, resilient. Clara lay there for 4 long minutes in the dim light, entirely captivated by that green line. She listened to the steady, rushing rhythm of her daughter's heart. It was a beautiful, defiant sound in the sterile darkness. The medication made her eyelids heavy, but her mind had never been sharper. The man in that photograph was a stranger. The life she had built with him was a complete illusion. Lying in that hospital bed alone, the old Clara died. The woman who woke up the next morning would be someone entirely different. She would be a mother, and she would be untouchable. The morning sun pierced through the horizontal hospital blinds. It cast sharp, bright lines across the white linoleum floor. The room smelled of terrible powdered eggs from the breakfast tray and strong antibacterial soap. Dr. Vance walked into the room at 8 o'clock. He picked up the heavy metal chart at the end of her bed. He studied the numbers closely. The medication worked, Dr. Vance said. His deep voice filled the quiet room. The contractions have completely stopped. The baby is stable, but you are now on strict, uncompromising bed rest. Your body gave you a massive warning last night. You cannot afford another stress event. I understand, Clara said quietly. She sat up slowly. Her body felt bruised and heavy, but her mind was incredibly sharp. The blinding fog of betrayal had burned away entirely during the long, terrifying night. I am discharging you, Dr. Vance added. He lowered the chart. Please, Clara, take care of yourself. I am going to, Clara answered. An hour later, Clara walked out of the sliding glass doors of the clinic. The autumn air was crisp and completely clear after the heavy storm. She walked to her SUV, parked in the concrete lot. She opened the heavy driver's side door and climbed in. She did not start the engine right away. She looked down at her left hand, resting on the dark leather steering wheel. The large, custom designed diamond sparkled brightly in the morning sun. Harrison had spent a fortune on it. He used to brag about the clarity of the stone to his wealthy clients. Clara grabbed the platinum band with her right thumb and index finger. She pulled. The heavy ring slid over her knuckle. It came off with a soft scrape. Clara placed the diamond into the dark center console. She did not look at it again. She looked back at her bare left hand. She gently rubbed the pale, indented skin left behind on her ring finger. The skin there was sensitive and completely untouched by the sun. It looked like a scar. The marriage is over, Clara thought. Her inner voice was a calm, factual statement. The man I married never really existed. I am mourning a ghost. She started the engine and drove home. When she pulled into the long driveway, Meredith S. silver sedan was already parked near the front door. Clara unlocked the house. The heavy oak door swung open. The overwhelming silence of the massive house no longer frightened her. It felt like a battlefield she was preparing to conquer. Meredith was sitting at the massive mahogany dining table. The polished wood was completely covered in thick stacks of paper, manila folders, and open laptops. The rich, savory smell of toasted bagels and roasted coffee filled the room. Eat, Meredith commanded. She pushed a paper plate across the table. You look completely exhausted. You need food for the baby. Clara sat down in one of the high-backed velvet chairs. She took a slow bite of the warm bagel. It tasted incredible. It was the first real thing she had eaten in days. Tell me what you found, Clara said. She swallowed the food. She reached for a black pen. Meredith pushed her reading glasses up her nose. Her eyes were dark and fiercely focused. He is incredibly arrogant, Meredith began. She pulled a thick stack of credit card statements to the center of the table. He thinks because he controls the primary bank accounts. He is untraceable, but he forgot that I helped you set up his corporate tax profile 4 years ago. I know exactly how to pull his expense reports. Meredith pointed a sharp red fingernail at a line item from 3 months ago. $2,000 at a boutique hotel downtown. Meredith read aloud, categorized as a client entertainment expense. Except the client listed was a manufacturing firm from Ohio. That firm went out of business 2 years ago. Clara stared at the number. 3 months ago. That was when she first started feeling the dull, lingering anxiety. Her intuition had been screaming at her, and she had ignored it. There is more, Meredith continued. Her voice dropped, becoming low and dangerous. She pulled up a separate piece of paper, a jewelry store charge for $800, a high-end florist charge for $200, all hidden under false vendor names on his corporate card. He has been systematically stealing from his own company to fund his affair with Paige. That is corporate fraud, Clara stated. She did not sound surprised. It is, Meredith agreed grimly. But here is the real prize. Meredith slid a printed digital receipt across the polished mahogany wood. I pulled the financial data for the day he supposedly mailed that DNA test to California, Meredith said. He used his corporate card to pay for the express shipping. The receipt logs the exact time and location of the transaction. Clara looked closely at the black ink. The transaction time was 2:15 in the afternoon. The location was a small postal annex located on the ground floor of Page's apartment building. He did not drop it off, Clara said. The pieces locked together perfectly. He gave the package to her. She went to her own building. She threw away his swab, rubbed a cotton swab inside her own cheek, and mailed it to the lab using his credit card. Exactly, Meredith smiled. It was a cold, predatory smile. The lab received female DNA. They compared it to your female DNA. Of course, the probability of him being the father came back as 0%. The sample did not even belong to a man. Clara leaned back in the velvet chair. The sheer audacity of the crime was breathtaking. Paige had intentionally contaminated a medical test to destroy a family, and Harrison was too blinded by his own ego to see it. Suddenly, Clara S.'s cell phone buzzed violently on the table. It vibrated against the hard wood. The screen illuminated. It was a text message from Harrison, then another, then a third. Ping, ping, ping. The harsh electronic sounds echoed in the quiet dining room. Clara picked up the phone. She opened the messages. I expect you to be packing. The first message read, the real estate agent is coming to evaluate the house on Monday. The second message read, leave your house keys on the kitchen counter when you go. I am not paying for your living expenses anymore. The third message read, Meredith read the messages over Clara's shoulder. Her face flushed with intense anger. Block him. Meredith hissed. Block his number right now. You do not have to listen to this abuse. Clara stared at the glowing screen. The words were incredibly cruel. They were designed to break her down. They were designed to make her feel small, powerless, and entirely alone. She placed the phone gently back onto the table. She didn't block his number. She needed the evidence. Every single text message he sent was another piece of rope he was wrapping around his own neck. Every threat, every demand, every arrogant command would be printed, highlighted, and handed directly to the family court judge. No, Clara said softly. Her voice was smooth and terrifyingly calm. Let him talk. Let him feel incredibly powerful. I want him to believe he has already won. She picked up her black pen. She pulled the thick stack of financial documents closer to her side of the table. We need to organize these chronologically, Clara instructed. She looked up at her best friend. Her eyes were completely dry when Dr. Vance calls me with the real legal medical report. We are going to invite my husband and his lawyers to a meeting, and we are going to bring this entire house down on top of him. The heavy cream envelope arrived with the gold seal of the clinic. It was delivered by a private medical courier at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. The man in the gray uniform handed it to Clara on her front porch. He asked for her signature on a digital pad. Clara signed her name with a steady hand. She walked back into the quiet kitchen. The morning sunlight poured through the large glass windows, warming the granite counter. Clara did not tear the envelope open frantically. She did not rush. She walked over to the kitchen drawer and pulled out the silver letter opener. She slid the sharp metal edge cleanly under the thick paper flap. She pulled out the certified medical document. The paper was heavy and crisp. It smelled faintly of fresh printer ink and sterile medical offices. She flattened the document on the counter. Her eyes scanned the administrative data. Patient 1, Clara. Patient 2, Harrison. Genetic markers extracted from hospital file. She looked down at the bold, black letters at the very bottom of the page. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. Clara let out a long, slow breath. The physical tension that had been coiled tightly at the base of her neck finally released. The truth was officially documented. It was bound by medical law. It was absolute. She did not call Harrison. She did not take a photograph of the paper and send it to his phone. Instead, she walked over to her laptop. She opened her email application. She typed a formal message to the senior partner at Harrison's law firm. She kept her tone deliberately passive and defeated. She wrote that she was heavily pregnant, entirely exhausted, and wished to avoid a devastating public scandal. She requested a private mediation meeting for that Friday morning. She stated she was ready to discuss surrendering the house and finalizing the divorce quickly. She pressed send. The response came back in less than 20 minutes. The lawyer eagerly agreed. Harrison was ready to sign the papers. The trap was officially set. 3 days later, Friday morning arrived. Clara stood in front of the full-length mirror in the master bedroom. She was 33 weeks pregnant. Her stomach was a prominent, heavy curve. She dressed with absolute, calculated precision. She did not want to look like a victim. She did not want to look devastated. She wanted to look untouchable. She chose a simple, elegant navy blue maternity dress. The thick fabric draped beautifully over her frame. She slipped into sensible, low black heels. She brushed her dark hair back into a sleek, severe knot at the base of her neck. She wore no jewelry, not a necklace, not a bracelet, and most importantly, her left hand was completely bare. The pale scar on her ring finger was exposed for the entire room to see. She walked downstairs. Meredith was waiting in the foyer. Meredith wore a sharp charcoal business suit. She held a thick black leather briefcase in one hand and a white paper coffee cup in the other. Meredith held out the warm coffee cup. Clara took it. The cardboard was hot against her palms. The bitter, roasted smell of black espresso cleared Clara's mind. "You look like a completely different woman," Meredith said. Her voice was quiet in the echoing hallway. "I am," Clara answered. Meredith looked down at Clara's bare left hand. A small, sad smile touched the corners of her mouth. "Honey, I have to tell you," Meredith said softly. "I never liked how he spoke to you in public. I never liked how he made you feel small so he could feel big. You deserve to take your power back today." Clara took a sip of the bitter coffee. "I am going to take everything back." They walked out to Meredith's silver sedan. They drove downtown in complete silence. The city traffic was heavy, but the steady rhythm of the tires rolling over the asphalt felt grounding. They arrived at the towering glass and steel office building that housed Harrison's legal team. They rode the mirrored elevator up to the 45th floor. Clara's ears popped as they ascended. The doors slid open with a soft chime. The reception area of the law firm was aggressively expensive. The walls were paneled in dark walnut. The floors were polished white marble. The air conditioning was turned up high, making the air crisp and freezing cold. A young receptionist led them down a long hallway. The sound of their footsteps was swallowed by the thick carpet. The receptionist opened the heavy double doors of the main conference room. Clara walked in. The room was massive. A long, polished oak table stretched across the center. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the city skyline below. Clara took a seat on the side of the table facing the door. Meredith sat directly next to her. Meredith placed the black leather briefcase on the table with a heavy, authoritative thud. They waited. The silence stretched. The antique clock on the walnut wall ticked. Tick, tock, tick. 10 minutes later, the double doors swung open again. Harrison walked into the lawyer's office looking like a victor. He wore a custom-tailored gray suit. His dark hair was perfectly styled. His posture was arrogant and relaxed. He looked like a man who had already won the war. He walked into the room, followed closely by a gray-haired man in a dark suit. That was his senior attorney. But there was a third person walking behind them. Clara watched as Paige stepped into the conference room. Paige wore a sharp, tailored white skirt suit. She carried a bright red designer handbag. She walked with a noticeable swagger, her high heels clicking sharply against the hardwood border of the room. As she entered, the aggressive, sweet scent of vanilla and white freesia flooded the enclosed space. Clara's lungs tightened automatically at the smell. Harrison pulled out a heavy leather chair. He did not pull it out for his lawyer. He pulled it out for Paige. She sat down directly across the table from Clara. She crossed her legs. A smug, victorious little smile played on her bright red lips. "Good morning," Harrison's lawyer said smoothly. He opened a thick manila folder. "Clara, thank you for agreeing to this mediation." Harrison felt it was best to handle this delicate situation quietly. "I am sure he did," Clara replied. Her voice was perfectly flat. "Who is she?" Meredith interrupted. She pointed a sharp fingernail directly at Paige. "This is a confidential legal mediation regarding marital assets. Outsiders are not permitted." Harrison leaned back in his leather chair. He placed his hands flat on the polished oak table. Paige is my colleague, Harrison stated proudly. He looked directly at Clara, his dark eyes flashing with cruel intent. She is also here as my emotional support. This has been an incredibly traumatic week for me. Discovering my wife's infidelity. Paige is here to help me through it. The absolute audacity of the statement hung in the freezing air. He had brought his mistress to his divorce mediation. He had brought the woman who actively falsified a medical document to destroy Clara's life, and he was framing her as a supportive friend. Clara sat perfectly still. This was the moment. This was the universal dilemma that every betrayed woman faces. Every single nerve in Clara's body screamed at her to react. Her chest burned with the sudden, violent urge to stand up. She wanted to throw the hot coffee across the expensive table. She wanted to scream at the top of her lungs. She wanted to reach across the polished wood and wipe that smug, entitled smile right off Paige's face. The anger was a physical fire, begging to be let out. I will not give them the satisfaction of my pain, Clara thought. Her inner voice was a fortress of ice. I will not become the hysterical, crazy wife they want me to be. Clara took a slow, deep breath. She forced her shoulders to drop. She relaxed her hands, placing them gently over her pregnant stomach. She felt her baby move. The small kick grounded her completely in reality. Clara looked directly at Paige. She did not glare. She did not scowl. Clara simply smiled. It was a tiny, cold, utterly terrifying smile. It was the smile of a woman who knew she was holding the winning lottery ticket. Paige's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. She shifted uncomfortably in her heavy leather chair. She looked away from Clara, focusing instead on her red handbag. If she wishes to stay and observe the ruin of a life, Clara said softly, her voice echoing perfectly in the quiet room, she is more than welcome to sit there. Harrison frowned. This was not the reaction he had anticipated. He expected tears. He expected begging. He expected Clara to crumble under the humiliation of Paige's presence. Let us proceed, Harrison's lawyer said quickly, sensing the strange shift in the room's energy. He pulled a thick stack of stapled papers from his folder. My client is prepared to be generous, considering the circumstances, the lawyer began. He slid the papers across the table toward Clara. Harrison is willing to pay for your medical expenses through the birth of the child. However, because of the fraudulent nature of the pregnancy, he is not offering any alimony. He requires you to vacate the primary residence by Monday. He will retain full ownership of all joint financial accounts to recover the damages of your deception. Meredith let out a harsh, loud bark of laughter. It was an incredibly disruptive sound in the formal setting. Harrison glared at her. Is something funny? You are, Meredith answered smoothly. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. You are absolutely hilarious, Harrison. Sign the papers, Clara, Harrison demanded. His voice grew hard and impatient. I am trying to save you from a very public, very humiliating court battle. If we go before a judge, I will submit the DNA test. The entire city will know what you did. Sign the papers, take your things, and leave. Clara looked down at the divorce agreement resting in front of her. The black ink looked sharp against the white paper. It was a document designed to erase her completely. She reached out with her right hand. She pushed the stack of papers back across the polished oak table. "I am not signing anything," Clara said. She turned to Meredith and gave a small nod. Meredith reached out and clicked the brass locks on the black leather briefcase. The sharp, metallic snaps echoed like gunshots in the quiet room. The trap was sprung. The long winter was finally over. The brass locks on the briefcase snapped open. Click, click. Meredith lifted the heavy leather lid. She reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of manila folders. She slapped them down onto the polished oak table. The sound was heavy and authoritative. "Before my client signs away her legal rights to a $3 million estate," Meredith began, her voice ringing clear in the silent room, "we have a few items to submit for the record." Harrison's lawyer frowned. He adjusted his glasses. "This is a mediation regarding asset division and adultery. We are not here to review." "You are going to want to review this," Meredith interrupted sharply. She slid the first folder across the table directly to the lawyer. "That is a compiled list of Harrison's corporate credit card expenses for the last 6 months. Highlighted in yellow are the thousands of dollars he spent at boutique hotels, high-end florists, and jewelry stores." Harrison shifted uncomfortably. His arrogant posture slipped slightly. "Those are legitimate client entertainment expenses. The clients listed do not exist." Meredith countered smoothly. "And if this goes to a family court judge, those records will be subpoenaed. You have been systematically embezzling from your own firm to fund your affair." The senior attorney stopped reading. He looked up slowly. He looked at Harrison. His professional demeanor hardened. A lawyer does not like being lied to by his own client. That is irrelevant to the paternity issue, Harrison said quickly. His voice pitched higher. He pointed a finger at Clara. "She cheated. The child is not mine. That is the core issue here." Clara finally moved. She reached into the leather briefcase. She did not rush. Her hands were perfectly steady. She pulled out the crumpled white cardboard shipping envelope, the exact one Harrison had thrown at her in the kitchen. She placed it gently in the center of the table. "You mailed this package on a Tuesday," Clara said. Her voice was quiet, but it commanded the entire room. "You told me you mailed it to California. You used your corporate card to pay for the express shipping." Harrison glared at her. "I did. I paid for it." Clara pulled out a single sheet of printer paper. It was the digital receipt Meredith had found. She slid it across the table, stopping it right next to the torn envelope. "Look at the origin zip code on that receipt," Clara instructed. Harrison leaned forward. His eyes scanned the paper. He blinked. The package was scanned into the postal system at 2:15 in the afternoon, Clara continued. Her voice was like smooth glass. It was scanned at the postal annex located directly beneath Paige's apartment building. Paige stopped breathing. The color drained completely from her bright, painted lips. She gripped the strap of her red handbag so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I do not understand." Harrison said. He looked genuinely confused. He looked back and forth between the receipt and the envelope. You did not mail it, Clara stated. It was not a question. You gave the package to Paige. You trusted her to mail it for you. She went back to her building. She opened the sealed envelope. She threw your cotton swabs in the garbage. She rubbed new swabs inside her own mouth. Then she mailed her female DNA to the laboratory under your name. The room went absolutely still. The silence was thick and suffocating. That is insane, Paige blurted out. Her voice was shaking. Harrison, she is making this up. She is lying. Harrison looked at Paige. He looked at the zip code on the receipt. He worked in finance. He understood numbers. He understood data trails. The absolute certainty in his eyes began to fracture. Is it true? Harrison asked Paige. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. No, Paige cried. She leaned toward him, desperate to maintain the illusion. She is a desperate woman trying to save her meal ticket. The DNA test proves she cheated. Clara reached into the briefcase one last time. She pulled out the heavy cream envelope with the gold foil seal, the seal of Dr. Vance's hospital clinic. The DNA test you ordered was fraudulent, Clara said calmly. So I took a real one, a legally binding, clinical chain of custody test conducted by a certified maternal fetal medicine specialist, with blood drawn from my arm and genetic markers pulled directly from your hospital medical file. Clara slid the heavy paper across the polished oak table. It stopped directly in front of Harrison. Read it, Clara commanded. Harrison stared at the gold seal. His hands began to tremble. He picked up the paper. He read the administrative data. He read the chain of custody block. Then his eyes dropped to the bold, black letters at the very bottom of the page. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. The paper slipped from Harrison's fingers. It fluttered to the table like a dead leaf. The blood rushed out of his face. He looked like he was going to be physically sick. The devastating reality of what he had done crashed down onto his shoulders all at once. He had believed a lie. He had abandoned his 8-month pregnant wife. He had locked her out of her own bank accounts. He had thrown away his entire family. And he had done it all for a woman who had manipulated him like a complete fool. Harrison, his lawyer asked quietly, looking at the legal document. Harrison could not speak. He buried his face in his hands. He let out a ragged, choking sound. It was the sound of a man watching his entire world burn to the ground by his own hand. Paige stood up abruptly. Her heavy leather chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. This is fake, Paige screamed. The sophisticated facade completely shattered. She faked this document. You cannot believe her. Harrison. Harrison slowly lowered his hands. He turned to look at Paige. His dark eyes were empty. There was no love left in them. There was only absolute, terrifying disgust. Get out, Harrison whispered. Harrison, please. Paige started, reaching for his arm. Get out of this room. Harrison roared. The sheer volume of his voice shook the glass windows. Do not ever speak to me again. Do not ever come near me again. Paige stumbled backward. She looked around the room in pure panic. She looked at the lawyer, who was staring at her with cold, professional contempt. She looked at Clara, who was sitting perfectly still. Paige grabbed her red handbag and practically ran out of the conference room. The heavy double doors slammed shut behind her. The silence returned. Harrison turned his head slowly. He looked across the table at his wife. His eyes were completely red. Tears spilled over his lower eyelids and tracked down his pale cheeks. Clara, Harrison choked out. His voice was broken. He sounded like a small, terrified child. Clara, I am so sorry. I did not know. I swear to God. I did not know she did that. Please, you have to believe me. Clara looked at him. She felt no pity. She felt no anger. She felt absolutely nothing at all, while Harrison wept. Clara unclasped her leather purse. She pulled out her wallet. She pulled out a small pack of tissues. She placed them neatly inside a side pocket. She pulled out her car keys. She arranged them next to her lip balm. She reorganized her purse while the lawyers watched in stunned silence, entirely unbothered by her husband's emotional collapse. Clara, please say something, Harrison begged. He reached his hand across the table, desperately trying to bridge the massive gap between them. Clara snapped her purse shut. The metallic click was sharp and final. You had a choice, Clara said. Her voice was soft, but it carried the heavy weight of absolute truth. When that first letter arrived in the mailbox, you had a choice. You could have trusted your wife of 6 years. You could have trusted the mother of your child. Instead, you chose to believe a ridiculous lie because it served your own selfish desires. Harrison withdrew his hand. He looked down at the polished wood. He had no defense. You froze my bank accounts when I was heavily pregnant, Clara continued. Her tone never wavered. You left me to give birth alone. You did not even answer the phone when I was in the hospital. I was wrong. Harrison sobbed. I was so completely wrong. Yes, you were, Clara agreed calmly. She turned her attention directly to the senior attorney. I am not signing your agreement, Clara told the lawyer. My attorney will be sending you our terms on Monday morning. I am keeping the primary residence. I am keeping the joint savings account to cover the financial abuse I endured this week. I am requesting full legal and physical custody of my daughter. You will be granted supervised visitation, to be determined by the court. The lawyer did not argue. He simply nodded. He knew a total defeat when he saw one. Clara, please, Harrison pleaded. He stood up. We can fix this. I will go to counseling. I will do whatever it takes. I love you. Clara stood up slowly. She smoothed the thick navy fabric over her pregnant stomach. I am not crazy, Clara stated. It was her final, quiet declaration. I know exactly who you are now, and you are no longer my problem. Clara turned around. She did not look back. She walked toward the heavy double doors. Meredith grabbed the black leather briefcase and followed closely behind her. They walked out into the long, carpeted hallway. They stepped into the mirrored elevator. The doors slid closed, cutting off the sound of Harrison weeping inside the conference room. As the elevator descended toward the ground floor, Clara looked at her reflection in the glass. Her shoulders were relaxed. The devastating weight she had carried for the past 2 weeks was completely gone. Her dignity remained spotless, while their world had collapsed in ruins. She had won. But more importantly, she was finally free. The brown packing tape tore from the plastic dispenser with a sharp, loud screech. Clara folded the top flaps of the heavy cardboard box. She pressed the sticky tape down firmly. She smoothed it over the edges with the palm of her hand. She packed the last box. The house was his. The life was hers. 2 full months had passed since the mediation in the freezing conference room. The transition had been a quiet, methodical process. Clara had won the legal battle completely. Her attorney had secured the entire joint savings account, full custody of her child, and a massive portion of Harrison's retirement funds. But Clara did not want the primary residence. She had looked at the massive brick fortress, with its sweeping staircases and cold marble floors, and realized she did not want to raise her daughter inside a museum of bad memories. The house was a golden cage. She demanded a full financial buyout of her equity instead. She took the money. She left him the empty walls. Clara stood up. Her body felt light. A soft, rhythmic breathing came from the woven bassinet near the window. Clara walked over. She looked down at her daughter. Grace was exactly 4 weeks old. She had a full head of dark hair and perfect, tiny hands. She smelled of warm milk and clean lavender lotion. Clara reached down and gently stroked the baby's soft cheek. Grace stirred slightly, let out a tiny sigh, and settled back into a deep sleep. The heavy front door opened downstairs. Footsteps echoed loudly on the bare hardwood floors. Clara did not panic. She knew exactly who it was. Today was the final walkthrough. Harrison appeared in the doorway of the nursery. He looked terrible. He was 36 years old, but the last 2 months had aged him a decade. His expensive tailored suit hung loosely on his frame. He had lost weight. Dark, heavy bags shadowed his eyes. The arrogant, untouchable financial executive was completely gone. The moving truck took the last load. Clara said quietly. She did not look up from the bassinet. I am just taking parental car. The keys to the front door are on the kitchen island. Harrison stepped into the room. He looked around at the bare walls. The beautiful sage green paint suddenly looked incredibly empty without the mahogany crib and the linen drapes. Clara, Harrison whispered. His voice was hoarse. Clara finally turned to look at him. She felt no anger. She felt no lingering resentment. She looked at the man she had loved for 6 years, and she felt absolutely nothing. It was a profound, peaceful apathy. Paige was fired. Harrison said suddenly. He took a hesitant step forward. The firm discovered she was charging personal expenses to corporate accounts. They let her go last week. She moved out of the city. I have not spoken to her since the mediation. He offered the information like a peace offering. He wanted her to know the other woman had been punished. He wanted her to feel vindicated. That does not matter to me, Harrison, Clara answered honestly. Her voice was perfectly smooth. I was out of my mind. Harrison pleaded. His eyes filled with desperate, frantic tears. The stress of the quarter, the fear of being a father, She completely manipulated me. She played into my worst insecurities. I was tricked. Clara crossed her arms over her chest. She looked at his desperate face. She thought about the years she had spent shrinking herself to make him comfortable. She thought about the career she had paused, the friends she had neglected, the constant effort to be the perfect, flawless wife. She finally understood that the prison door had been unlocked the whole time. She had been her own jailer. You were not tricked into abandoning me, Clara said. Her tone was gentle, but it offered zero forgiveness. You were not tricked into locking my bank accounts. You were not tricked into ignoring my phone call when I was in the hospital. You made those choices. You wanted an easy way out, and you took it. I am so sorry. Harrison choked out. A single tear rolled down his cheek. I lost everything. You did, Clara agreed simply. She walked over to the bassinet. She carefully lifted Grace into her arms. The baby was warm and solid against her chest. Clara grabbed her leather diaper bag and slung it over her shoulder. She walked toward the doorway. Harrison stepped aside. He did not try to stop her. He knew he had no right. Will you at least let me see her? Harrison asked. His voice broke completely as he looked at the sleeping infant. Your lawyer has the supervised visitation schedule, Clara said without looking back. You can coordinate with the court-appointed monitor. Clara walked down the curved wooden staircase for the very last time. Her footsteps were steady. The antique grandfather clock had been sold. The house was entirely silent. She walked out the front door and stepped into the bright, crisp morning air. She strapped Grace securely into her car seat. She got into the driver's seat. She started the engine. She drove out of the long driveway. She did not look in the rearview mirror. An hour later, Clara pulled into a completely different neighborhood. It was a quiet, tree-lined street on the edge of the city. Small, charming houses sat behind low wooden fences. Clara parked in front of a bright white cottage with a wide front porch and a yellow door. This was her new home. It was less than half the size of the brick fortress. It did not have marble floors or a grand foyer, but it was entirely hers. She had bought it in cash. Meredith was waiting on the front porch. She wore casual jeans and a comfortable gray sweater. She held a steaming ceramic mug in her hand. The movers finished unloading 10 minutes ago, Meredith announced. She smiled warmly as Clara carried the baby up the wooden steps. I told them to put all the heavy boxes in the spare bedroom. We can unpack them tomorrow. Thank you, Clara said. She felt a deep, overwhelming wave of gratitude for her best friend. Go inside. Settle the baby. I made tea, Meredith said. Clara walked through the yellow door. The house smelled of fresh paint and lemon cleaner. It was bright. It was warm. It felt safe. She placed Grace gently into a new, smaller crib in the cozy nursery. She stood there for a moment, just watching her daughter breathe. The horrific nightmare of the past 2 months felt like a distant, faded movie. Clara walked into the new kitchen. She did not unpack a single box. She found the box labeled with her clothing. She opened it. She pulled out an old, faded, oversized wool sweater. The sleeves were slightly frayed. It was not elegant. It was not designer. It was just comfortable. She slipped the heavy sweater over her shoulders. She grabbed a warm mug of chamomile tea from the counter. She walked back out to the front porch. Clara sat down in a wooden rocking chair next to Meredith. The wood creaked softly under her weight. The morning air was sharp, smelling faintly of pine needles and damp earth. She brought the ceramic mug to her lips. She took a slow sip. The warm liquid coated her throat. She did not care that her hair was messy. She did not care that she was wearing a worn-out sweater. The exhausting need to project a perfect image was completely gone. She was entirely comfortable in her own skin. A gentle breeze blew through the trees. A small set of silver wind chimes hanging from the porch roof jingled softly. Chime, chime, chime. It is incredibly quiet out here, Meredith said softly. She looked out at the peaceful street. It is perfect, Clara answered. She rested her head against the high wooden back of the rocking chair. She closed her eyes. The winter had been incredibly long, and the storm had nearly broken her, but she had survived. She had protected her child. She had protected her dignity. She opened her eyes and looked at the bright blue sky above the trees. A deep, quiet joy bloomed softly inside her chest. Starting over felt impossible. Clara whispered into the crisp morning air. Her inner voice was a powerful, final declaration of victory. But staying would have destroyed me. She took another sip of her tea. The spring had finally arrived, and it was absolutely beautiful.
As the screen fades to black on Clara's journey, we are left with a profoundly cinematic conclusion that goes far beyond a simple tale of revenge. This story operates on multiple layers, serving as a gripping psychological study of power, ego, and the invisible chains we sometimes place on ourselves. The core lesson this narrative delivers is about the dangerous illusion of the perfect life. Clara built a golden cage for herself, pausing her own brilliance and professional career to fit into a mold created by a husband whose ego demanded constant feeding. Harrison S.'s downfall was not just caused by his infidelity. It was triggered by his overwhelming, blinding arrogance. He was so desperate to play the victim, so eager to find a structural flaw in his own wife, that he blindly accepted a fabricated lie from his mistress without checking the origin scan of a shipping label. He lacked the critical thinking that Clara possessed in spades. Furthermore, this story highlights the absolute necessity of unwavering self-trust. When the world tells you that you are wrong, when the evidence, even an official-looking medical document, screams that you are guilty, trusting your own reality is the ultimate act of defiance. Clara did not succumb to the gaslighting. She washed a coffee mug in scalding hot water just to anchor herself to the physical world. And then she went to work. She didn't fight fire with fire. She fought chaos with cold. Calculated strategy. We also cannot overlook the incredible value of female solidarity, represented brilliantly by her best friend, Meredith. In a world where women are often pitted against each other, as seen with Paige's malicious sabotage, Meredith stands as the ultimate ally. She is the loyal guardian who weaponized her professional accounting skills to protect her friend. It is a powerful reminder to curate an inner circle that will gladly go to war for you when you cannot stand on your own 2 feet. Ultimately, the true victory in this story isn't the massive financial settlement, the legal win, or the absolute destruction of Harrison's ego. The real triumph is Clara's total emotional detachment. The opposite of love isn't hate, it's apathy. By walking away from the massive brick fortress and choosing the peaceful, sunlit cottage, she reclaimed her autonomy. She realized that staying in a toxic environment, no matter how luxurious, would destroy her soul. This narrative is a meticulously drafted blueprint for surviving the unthinkable. It teaches us that while we cannot control the betrayals inflicted upon us, we have absolute authority over our response. You are not a fragile vessel. You are the architect of your own life. Never let anyone else draw the blueprints. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.